We are in the midst of a uniquely alarming moment, right? A moment where the President of the United States sees an unfolding situation as a political opportunity, one for him to advance his goal of strengthening and fortifying his grip on power. Because what's happening in Los Angeles is not just about immigration. We all know that. President Barack Obama carried out more deportations in his 8 years in any administration at a pace quicker than even Donald Trump's first term. Do you remember ICE raids in the middle of cities by men wearing paramilitary gear and then Obama sending in the National Guard over the objections of governors? Yeah, neither do I, because that never happened. Do you know why it never happened? It never happened because carrying out a legal and orderly and effective immigration policy isn't at all what Trump is doing. Trump seems from the outside to be producing theater. And maybe it's to distract. Maybe it's to distract us from talking about Elon Musk's tweet with his unsubstantiated allegations about Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, something we on the outside have seen no proof of. Maybe it's to distract from his plunging approval ratings on the economy, trade, inflation, even immigration. Maybe he's trying to distract us from covering his stalled agenda in Congress. That's actually what the big fight with Elon Musk started over. Maybe he wants to distract us from covering the debacle of a trade war he started, or the debacle of 90 deals in 90 days to which there is 0.5, like 0.5 deals, 0.5. Former ICE official Jason Hauser tells the New York Times this, quote, "Right now, the government is burning thousands of federal law enforcement hours on operations that privilege political objectives over public safety, attacking constitutional protections like due process and free speech as they do. If this administration does not correct course, it will lock the country into a future of weaker enforcement, lowered trust in public safety officials, and greater risk to Americans' collective safety." Hauser will join our program in the next block. He wrote that 2 months ago, before Donald Trump's Rubicon crossing moment this weekend. Donald Trump's decision to federalize and deploy the National Guard over the objections of California's Governor Gavin Newsom, with 500 Marines on standby amid protests against raids by ICE, is something the likes of which we haven't seen in the United States of America since the year 1965. The last American president to deploy the National Guard without a request from a state's governor was Lyndon B. Johnson, and he did it in that instance to protect civil rights protesters in Alabama. California's Governor Gavin Newsom had this to say about this move from Donald Trump.
I've worked with the National Guard. We've deployed the National Guard. We did 3,000+ folks have been doing logistics work and fire recovery work, and they're fighting the fires, the rattlesnake teams. We did the same back in George Floyd. We have no problem working collaboratively in a mutual aid system with local law enforcement, but there's a protocol, there's a process. He didn't care about that. And the worst part, he completely lied. He said in a tweet that everything's now safe, everything's fine. Is that the case, Mr. Trump? He said because he deployed the National Guard. The Guard hadn't even been deployed when he said this. It's Orwellian, simply lying to people. Unconstitutional, illegal act, his mess. We're trying to clean it up.
Today, the state of California sued the Trump administration over the deployment of the National Guard. He and other officials insist that the deployment has only made a volatile situation worse, something that they could have handled on their own. The New York Times reports this about the situation on the ground before Trump sends in the National Guard. Quote, "Although some demonstrations have been unruly, local authorities in Los Angeles County did not indicate during the day that they needed federal assistance. But the reality on the ground did not and does not matter to the Trump administration." The New York Times reports this as well. On social media, Trump, his aides, and allies have sought to frame the demonstrations against immigration officials on their own terms. They have shared images and videos of the most violent episodes, focusing particularly on examples of protesters lashing out at federal agents, even as many remained peaceful. At the White House this morning, Trump called the protesters, quote, "insurrectionists." In short, he is looking for ammo to justify invoking the Insurrection Act and moving closer to something he has talked about doing for a long time, using the military against the, quote, enemy within. Here's what his former chief of staff, John Kelly, had to say in terms of a warning about this moment.
And I think this issue of using the military to go after American citizens is one of those things I think is a very, very bad thing. Even to say it for political purposes to get elected, I think it's a very, very bad thing, let alone actually doing it. When I was in the White House, for that matter, DHS, I was, originally the conversation would be, Mr. President, that's outside your authority, or, that's a routine use. You really don't want to do that inside the United States. But now that he's talking about it as I'm going to do it is again, it's disturbing.
Again, that's a warning given by General John Kelly ahead of last November's election about what Trump sought to do the first time that he, Kelly, and others stopped him from doing, and why, the impact it would have on the military. But Donald Trump gave the game away when he was asked on Saturday about sending in troops. Take a listen.
Even if you're not planning to invoke the Insurrection Act, you still plan to send troops?
Well, we're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country.
We're going to have, quote, troops everywhere. They're going to be everywhere. Active duty troops. Trump promises to bring what's happening in Los Angeles right now to Trump's word, quote, we're going to have troops everywhere, to everywhere. Today, a new round, a fourth day of protests is underway right now in the wake of the ICE raids across the city. One of those raids took place at a Home Depot parking lot. Washington Post reports this about that raid, quote, 6 migrants who said they were present recounted how federal immigration authorities began handcuffing anyone they could grab in one of several raids in the city that would spark a wave of unrest and leave immigrant workers of all stripes jolted. One migrant saying this, quote, they were just grabbing people. They didn't ask questions. They didn't know if any of us were in any kind of immigration process. The nation's second largest city, a flashpoint today in both Trump's immigration crackdown and his war on the rule of law. It's where we begin today with NBC's Jacob Soboroff, who is at the site of one of the ICE raids that took place on Friday that sparked the initial protests. Can you do one thing before you brilliantly take us into this moment? Can you just rewind the tape a little bit and reset me on what has happened there over the weekend?
Yeah, of course, Nicole. And your introduction was really wonderful because I think what it sets up so perfectly is how unusual and how unprecedented the size and the scale and the scope of the immigration enforcement operations that took place in Los Angeles, starting with right here at this Home Depot in Cypress Park at 7 o'clock, 7:15, 7:30 on Friday morning, were and why they led to those protests. The big picture is Los Angeles is a so-called majority minority city and a majority minority state. There are more people of color that live in Los Angeles than white people at this point, and many of those people are undocumented. By some counts, 10% of the population of LA County, one of the largest counties, the largest county by population in the United States, is undocumented, maybe as many as 1 million people. Those people are our neighbors, our coworkers, our classmates, our friends, our parishioners, fellow parishioners in churches. They are part of the fabric of the city of Los Angeles. And not in the last many decades under Democratic nor Republican presidents, despite the fact that you had presidents with big deportation programs, Democratic and Republican, as you have so often reported, have we seen the type of immigration enforcement we saw play out on the streets of Los Angeles on Friday. And that struck fear into the heart of not just the undocumented community here, but of many U.S. citizen family members of undocumented people and many U.S. citizens who know those people, because that is removing people from this community who have been here, if not their entire life, virtually their entire lives. There are so many mixed status families that live in Los Angeles that might have an undocumented parent or relative and U.S. citizen child or cousin who, we've talked about this before. The family separation policy of the first Trump administration in 2018 was a deliberate ripping apart of parents and children at the border to to separate those families and inflict pain on those families. But when I say mass deportation is family separation, when I say those signs that were held up on the floor of the Republican convention, as I talked to you from the floor of that convention, was a sign of what was to come, and why that is also a form of family separation. It is family separation in the interior. It's taking parents away from their children, not at the border and not in detention centers, but at a Home Depot on a street corner, or outside of a school, or at a workplace in the fashion district where they might be working in a factory. It's a different form of family separation, and it's exactly the intent of this administration, modeled after, Nicole, Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1954 operation with a name so racist, I'm not going to say it here to you right now, but that resulted in 1 million Mexicans and some Mexican Americans being sent to Mexico in the wake of the Bracero program, coming here legally in the 1950s. That's what the Trump administration is modeling this program after. That's their stated goal. They've talked about it. And so now we're seeing it effectuated on the streets of the largest county in America, second largest city in America, with the largest undocumented population in America, where those people interact. I say those people, we all interact on a daily basis here. And it has terrified so many people, which is why you saw people before the protests turned violent, and there was certainly violence associated with those protests before the protests turned violent, a largely peaceful protest to actually the conversion in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center, where so many of those people were picked up by ICE at locations like this, in order to say this is not acceptable for the people of Los Angeles. The undocumented people, the documented people, everyone who knows how important that community is to the fabric of this one, Nicole.
We have laws. We have to go by the laws. We can't move in the National Guard. I can call insurrection, but there's no reason to ever do that, even in a Portland case. We can't call in the National Guard unless we're requested by a governor.
Thank God it is finally time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Rachel, go on and on. There's no hurry.
I have been looking forward to hearing what you have to say in your A Block tonight all weekend long. I cannot wait.
Well, you know, Rachel, in 2020, when Donald Trump was in what was then his failed re-election campaign for president against Joe Biden, he in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, he very specifically said the president cannot just send in the National Guard to any state. The governor has to request it, and the president cannot just send them in. And he said, I could, something like, I could call an insurrection, but, that hasn't happened. And so he's on record, of course, saying exactly the opposite of what he's now doing, as he has been with so many things. But this one is really quite striking. I think we're going to have that video ready. Actually, they're working on it right now. The longer you and I talk about it, it gives them a minute in the control room to get that piece inserted where I'm hoping it's going to be inserted when we need it. But it's right there, and we'll have it by the end of the hour if we don't have it early.
I mean, the difference between when he was talking about that then and what he's doing now is that whether or not he remembers what he once knew about how America works, he's decided that he's throwing it all out, dictator from day one, and, gonna terminate parts of the Constitution. And he's decided that he doesn't matter what Congress does and it doesn't matter what the courts do, that he's just the strong man. And he's going to be, in for another term in 2028. I mean, he's decided to throw out all the rules. The thing that has done, as far as I'm concerned, is make him very boring. Because it's like, it's all on the table. We know exactly what he's doing. We know exactly what his intentions are. He's blonde Berlusconi. This is just, he's just trying to do the same thing all the other strongmen and would-be dictators do all over the country. I think the really interesting question is what the country lets him get away with. And we're seeing a really interesting test of that right now all over the country, especially this week.
And we're also seeing the difference between the advisors he had in the White House the first time and the people he has now. He obviously had a White House counsel in his first presidency who was telling him, no, it's illegal. You cannot just send in the National Guard. The governor has to request it. And now he has people telling him whatever he wants to hear, whenever he wants to hear it.
Yeah, I think that if we can intuit what he's being told, I think based on the pattern of his actions, we can probably intuit that what he's being told is, yeah, it's illegal, therefore go do it. I mean, I think that the more laws he breaks, the more blatantly unconstitutional things he both proposes and tries, I think the more they think power accrues to him because he's less constrained by things that don't actually stop him. And so ultimately, I mean, the courts are pushing him back. Congress, to a certain extent, is pushing him back a little bit, although I think a little bit more than they're given credit for. But mostly it's the people pushing him back. He's deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular and underwater on every issue. And he is absolutely panicked by the protests against him, to the point where he's already playing the biggest cards that he's got, and he's not even 6 months into this term. I just think we're getting the test really early, and I think that he's failing.
By the way, one of the important things that Mayor Bass brought out when you were talking to her about what's happening in Los Angeles tonight, and you know this, but just how isolated and tiny a spot of Los Angeles we're talking about. Downtown Los Angeles, where in the areas where these office buildings are, very few people live anywhere near that. It's not a residential area. Most people living in Los Angeles, most Los Angeles local taxpayers never set foot in that part of Los Angeles. You can easily live a life there and never see it. And so it is this really isolated little spot that doesn't in any way disrupt any protest that's being held down there outside a federal building, doesn't in any way disrupt anything about the way life is lived in Los Angeles.
I mean, even if these protests were 100 times the size that they are, there still wouldn't be an operational reason to bring in active duty troops or federalized National Guard. I mean, it's not that sort of thing. This is obviously not operationally necessitated, right, in terms of the security of the city. He's doing this because he's panicking and thinks that he looks weak and therefore he has to do something that seems strong. And so we will have tanks destroying the streets of Washington this Saturday, and we will have National Guardsmen and active duty U.S. Marines standing around Los Angeles wondering what this has to do with their military careers. And it's all because he has no freaking idea how to deal with this politically, and he's absolutely panicking about the, I think, trenchant and joyful and sustainable opposition against him.
Yeah, it is clearly something he has been all too eager to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Once you've done this, though, there's not much else to do. Sorry, big guy, last card.
Right. We will see. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks.
President Trump says he assumes his relationship with Elon Musk is now over after their online feud exploded last week. When asked by NBC's Christian Welker if he has any desire to repair ties with Musk, Trump said no, adding he has no intention of speaking to the Tesla CEO. But Trump also issued a warning to Musk, saying he will face very serious consequences if he funds Democratic candidates to run against Republicans that vote in favor of the budget bill. Trump didn't share what those consequences would be. The president also cast doubt on the notion that Musk's opposition would even sink the bill, claiming he's more confident than ever it will pass because Republicans are more unified in the wake of that public feud. Joining us now, national politics reporter for The Hill, Julia Manchester. Julia, is that true? Do you get the sense that Republicans are more unified now than ever? I couldn't help but notice that Senator Ron Johnson, who has been outspoken about his concerns about this bill, was ever so slightly more muted over the weekend. Is that a sign of what the president's talking about here?
Well, look, Ali, I think you have a lot of these fiscal conservatives who had, problems in the first place with the sign of this bill, the size of this bill, like Ron Johnson, for example, maybe holding back in their criticism a bit. However, in general, if you take a broader look at Republicans as a whole, I think they are very much unified behind President Trump. I think President Trump at this point is obviously the face and the leader of the Republican Party. Even though Elon Musk holds quite a bit of influence, I still think President Trump holds some sway there. The only issue, though, is, like I said, with those very fiscally conservative Republicans who might, see some agreement with Elon Musk on this. And I think with Elon Musk going forward, if we look at him, as a potential, I don't want to say challenger to President Trump, but someone who's going to be a voice of opposition, he is someone who has, over 22 million, Twitter X followers. He's someone who has that very broad, wide platform. So, you know, he is someone who could certainly push back on Trump. But right now, I think Republicans are relatively unified behind the president.
I don't really call it X either, Julia, for what it's worth. It's hard to get out of that old habit. Yeah, it definitely happens. But look, they are also men who culturally are still aligned. I mean, you look at Elon Musk's feed right now, and he's echoing a lot of the same sentiments that Trump and others within the administration are echoing around immigration and what we're seeing on the ground in Los Angeles. So there is still a mutuality between these two guys. I think the open question is, and this is a question for Republicans and Democrats, frankly, what role politically could Musk play? You see Trump saying he'll face consequences if he funds Democrats. But the other litmus test on the Democratic side of the aisle has been, would you even take that money from him? People like Senator Cory Booker and others saying, no, I wouldn't take it. But that's kind of where Democrats are being faced right now, right? Like, how do they maneuver around the Musk of it all?
Well, it's interesting because you have Congressman Ro Khanna from California, who is seen as this more progressive figure, but, you know, obviously has those ties to Silicon Valley. It's a part of his congressional district. He's saying, look, Democrats should open up a dialogue with Elon Musk. But, you know, I think, that's going to be very difficult for a number of Democrats at this point, because like you said, Musk and Trump are politically and culturally aligned here. I think it would be hard for a lot of Democrats to jump on board, particularly in the wake of these mass, DOGE cuts and, Elon Musk's role in really trying to reduce the size of the federal government. The question I have politically, though, is less about what, him potentially funding Democratic challengers, but potentially maybe conservative or Republican challengers, people who might be aligned with, let's say, Ron Johnson, who are, pushing back against the size of that so-called big, beautiful bill.
Yeah, and certainly Johnson has company there, right? There's plenty of House Republicans who were strong-armed into voting for this the first time. There's an open question of maybe they get a little bit more oomph behind their complaints because of someone like Musk. But I want to kind of stay on the campaign politics of it for 1 second, because we've seen Musk be a pretty salient political point for Democrats. I know it's a limited set of information, but Wisconsin, Florida, that was the height of Musk and DOGE. In your conversations with Democratic strategists, do they still see that as something that they want to play up, even though Musk has made an about-face on this key piece of legislation?
I think to an extent, I think Democrats and Republicans I actually talk to sort of downplay Musk's influence politically when it comes to elections. I mean, he, put what, $100,000, $200,000 into those Florida races, but it was really special elections, but it was really that Wisconsin Supreme Court race that was seen as, in a way, a failure for Musk. He poured millions and millions of dollars, traveled to Wisconsin to campaign, for the conservative campaigning for that seat, and he ultimately failed. And even though he's really pushing, or last Friday or Thursday, he was saying, well, Republicans wouldn't have a majority or President Trump wouldn't be president if it wasn't for me. If you actually look at Musk's record during the presidential campaign, even though he was the top individual donor, not all of his endorsed candidates and congressional candidates won. And we know that, President Trump's campaign was in many ways a team effort, from Republicans across the ecosystem. So I think there is a downplaying as to, how much of a threat Musk could be going forward.
Yeah, I do hear that downplaying. I also think that Democrats could have success if they continue to keep him in the spotlight. Plus, regardless of whether or not it was a team effort, a few $100 million always helps in a campaign year, especially in states like Pennsylvania. Julia Manchester, thank you for joining us.
So what is the most important story in our news right now in our country, in this moment in American history? I mean, there is clearly, I think if we're being honest, we sort of stop beating around the bush about it. There's really no question what the United States is up against right now. I mean, the intentions of this president are not a mystery. There's no suspense. There's no ambiguity, right? We know exactly who he is. We know exactly what he wants to do to the country, right? No question, no mystery. It's as plain as day. The real question we are contending with, the real black box, the real drama, the story that really does need to be dug up and explained and told in our country because it is as yet undecided. The real mystery is not him. We know him. We know what he wants and what he's trying to do. The real mystery is, will he succeed? Will he get what he wants? And the answer to that will not be found by looking at him or by watching his actions. The answer to that question will come from the people of this country. The most important story of our time is this one. What is this country going to allow him to do? This is an attempted authoritarian overthrow of the United States Constitution and the U.S. government, the attempted imposition of a dictatorial regime. That is clear. That is unambiguous. I think it is unquestioned. I think there are very few people on any side of American politics who would contend with that. The question is whether it will work. And the way we will find out whether or not it's going to work is not going to be something that happens in the White House. It's going to be something that happens in the streets and in the courts and in the states and in Congress and in every other place that people are trying to say no. The strength of the movement against him is what will determine our fate as a country. And what we are seeing over and over again in what I believe is the most important story in the country, what we are seeing over and over again is that protesting against him works. That he wants to seem strong, but he is not that strong. Organizing against him works. Fighting him in court works. Pushing back works. Protesting in the streets works. And so Marcelo is free in Milford, Massachusetts. And Carol is free in Missouri. And the 4-year-old girl in Bakersfield, California is free and alive. And in Albuquerque, the movement to keep Antonio here means that Antonio is still here. And none of these things are instant, right? And they don't always work. But pushback is the only thing that ever does work. By Saturday this weekend, we were on to a second day of large-scale protests in Los Angeles against similarly over-the-top militarized raids by Trump's immigration agents. I mean, it started in Los Angeles this weekend, Friday and Saturday. By Sunday, there were solidarity rallies in Bakersfield, California, and in Houston, and a big one in Phoenix and in San Antonio, and again in San Diego, a big one in San Francisco where dozens of people were arrested. People in Pasadena protested outside the hotel where they learned ICE officers were staying during these immigration raids in Los Angeles. I mean, as of Saturday night, Trump had started fulminating against the protests in Los Angeles. He had announced that he would federalize the National Guard. It's the first time a president has done that against the wishes of a state's governor in 60 years. And when it was done 60 years ago, it was to protect civil rights protesters, not to threaten protesters with military force. But, you know, Trump panicking like that, the response of the American people to it has been exactly what you'd think. I mean, bigger protests than ever in Los Angeles, the solidarity protests that I just listed all day Sunday in all those cities all across the country. Today, solidarity protests in Atlanta, across the street from Atlanta's Immigration Court building. Solidarity protests today in Baltimore. Solidarity protests today in Boston and also in Chicago. In Tampa, Florida today, there was a huge solidarity protest. In Raleigh, North Carolina, in Washington, D.C. today, there were protests outside the Justice Department headquarters. You know, and when people stand up and protest, what we are learning over and over again in this administration is that protest works. And one of the ways that it works is that it puts steel in the spine of the political opposition in this country. For elected Democrats, it clarifies things for them. It shows them that the more they themselves push back as elected officials, the more support they will have from their own constituents. And so it's a sort of virtuous circle, right? Amid this primal surge of protest, this moral revulsion and rejection of what Trump is doing, I mean, you see the elected Democrats stepping up and standing up, too.
Tom Homan, the border czar, said to me yesterday he did not rule out literally arresting you, nor Mayor Bass, if you interfere in his words. He said you hadn't yet.
He's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do that? He knows where to find me. But you know what? Lay your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Lay your hands off these poor people who are just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes, been here 10 years. The fear, the horror, the hell is this guy? come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy. You know, I don't give a damn.
What are you going to do? You going to shoot some kid who's afraid of you and run? You going to shoot an elected official? If you shoot me, you better shoot straight. I don't know why you're in my city. You did. The governor was not contacted. This is Trump and his outrageous attempt to not only target our sanctuary city, but to frighten us and intimidate us. This is wrong, and I hope that none of you will use those guns to shoot anybody. There's no reason to shoot anybody. Don't allow them to make your service in a service where you're killing people. Don't do it. Defy them. Don't shoot those guns for anything.
Don't shoot those guns for anything. I mean, did you see what happened this past week in Minneapolis? This ridiculous military dress-up pageant that they put on in the streets of Minneapolis a few days ago? I mean, this is not the National Guard. This is agents from various federal agencies. Seems like there's a lot of them from HSI, which is the inexplicable, not at all trained for this force inside the Department of Homeland Security that they keep deploying like this in these embarrassing Banana Republic, shambolic shows of disorganized force. I mean, what are you doing here in Minneapolis? When Trump issued his order to federalize the National Guard over the issue or over the objections of California's governor this weekend, that order was not specific to Los Angeles. It was not specific to California. That order that he issued is something that he could use to send National Guard troops anywhere, or even active duty forces. Now he's sending 700 Marines, supposedly, from the Marine Corps base at 29 Palms. And that is a portrait of weakness. Right? That is what you get when you have a supposed leader, a supposed strongman even, who can't figure out how to get the support of his people. And he knows it. That is what you get when you have a weak president, an unpopular president who sees the people are against him, who can't defend his actions, who is losing support over time and not gaining it, even on the issues where he thinks he's supposed to be strongest. This is a president who has no other ideas and no skills to get him out of this political pickle that he is in, and who has therefore rushed right to the end and has decided that if the people are against him, well, then he will bludgeon.
Joining us now, border czar for the Trump administration, Tom Homan. Mr. Homan, thank you for joining us this morning. We have now seen 3 days worth of wide-scale immigration enforcement in L.A. County, in the Fashion District, at the Home Depot there. When your appointment was announced, you said that ICE, your agency, would focus on national security threats and public safety threats. Were there public safety threats in the Fashion District and at that Home Depot in these raids we've seen?
Yeah, and that's what no one's talking about. The Fashion District wasn't an immigration raid. It was a service of 3 criminal warrants at locations based on a large criminal conspiracy that ICE have been investigating. That has to do with money laundering, tax evasion, and customs fraud, where a company underdeclared over $80 million in goods, failed to pay $17 million in fees. And it's part of an overall conspiracy on numerous businesses that they believe that some of this money is being laundered in Mexico and Colombia to fund cartel activity. So this was a criminal investigation that they all responded to in the beginning. That's how it all started. But the facts never got out. Even though we put the facts out, the media didn't cover it. They just said immigration raids, and we're separating families and all the negative information we hear all the time. We took a lot of bad people off the street last couple of days. A Vietnamese national that attended a graduation party was kicked out and came back and killed 2 young people, two young Americans. We arrested a child predator. We arrested someone for sexual misconduct. Someone arrested for convicted of armed robbery. We arrested numerous gang members. What ICE did the last couple of days is make Los Angeles safer by taking public safety threats off the street.
Is everyone that has been arrested by ICE agents have a criminal record like those you've described?
Absolutely not. And I said from day one, January 20th, we will prioritize public safety threats and national security threats. However, we will enforce law. I may prioritize my family life over over my work. It doesn't mean I ignore my work. We're going to force the immigration law. We've been honest about that from day one, especially in sanctuary cities where we can't get the bad guy in the safety and security of a jail. They release him to the street. Well, we got to go to the street and find them. And when we find them, many times they're with others. Others that are in the United States illegally, may not be a criminal target, but guess what? If ICE is there arresting that bad guy and other illegal aliens are there, we're going to arrest them. That's what sanctuary cities get. They put us in the neighborhood, they force us in the neighborhood. This is what happens.
Well, that sort of action there you're describing has met with a lot of pushback from local officials, the mayor of Los Angeles, and the governor, who's also very critical of the National Guard being deployed, suggesting that's provoking some of these clashes. It's sort of it is a rarely used maneuver by the president of the United States to deploy National Guard members like this over the objections of the governor to the city streets. So, Mr. Homan, were you part of the decision-making process to deploy the National Guard? What is your response to those in that state who say they're only making the situation worse?
Then they should have taken action the last 2 days while the city burned. I mean, he waited over 2 days for all this violence to say he had an unlawful assembly. I mean, I was there when 1,000 protesters were surrounding the federal building, breaching that federal building, putting our officers at risk, putting the illegal aliens to be arrested and they were in custody at risk. It was out of control. So I support President Trump's decision on deploying the National Guard. They're there to protect property and life, not just of law enforcement officers you see being attacked the last couple of days, to protect citizens too. So if they fail to control that city, and we're there, we're going to do everything we can to protect our buildings, protect our officers. And so calling out the National Guard, I think is the right thing to do. I was on the ground. Governor Newsom wasn't. I've seen this for the first couple of days. He didn't. So I think President Trump made the right decision deploying the National Guard to protect life and property. That's exactly what they're doing. And these people that are they can call them protesters. Many are peaceful protesters. Many are not. Many are criminals. We had an incident where someone threw a Molotov cocktail at a law enforcement officer. Now, we've just seen recently what a Molotov cocktail can do. So what I've said I've been attacked for a comment I made a couple of days ago. The rhetoric keeps continuing. The violence keeps continuing. It's a matter of time before someone loses their life. So using throwing a Molotov cocktail at an officer can certainly be met with deadly force. The rhetoric has to stop. People have to stop calling ICE terrorists and criminals and racists, because they're enforcing the laws enacted by Congress, signed by a president. And that's exactly what ICE is doing. They're enforcing the law. They're not making this up. They're trying to make everyone safer, one illegal criminal at a time.
We should say officials there, Governor, Mayor, also the commissioner of the LAPD, says that the vast majority of protesters there have been peaceful. Mr. Homan, I want to talk about a new tactic here from ICE in recent weeks, it seems. Some arrests made at immigration courts, also at schools across the country. We've seen Michigan, Massachusetts, a couple in New York City. Are those students, many of the teenagers for the most, are they public safety threats? Why are they now being targeted at places where used to be children were felt safe? What do you say to parents who now say they're afraid to send their kids to school?
Well, it's ridiculous. Against a false narrative being pushed by the media. ICE, Secretary Noem ended the sensitive location policy that ICE had. Only federal law enforcement agency that had such a policy. That law enforcement couldn't enter a college campus, couldn't enter a medical facility to arrest a public safety threat. And you can't point at one instance where ICE has raided a school. And I see the stories, raided an elementary school, never happened. Raided churches, doesn't happen. Raided a hospital, doesn't happen. However, I'll say this. We did away with that policy because there's no sanctuary in this country for a significant public safety threat or national security threat. There's no sanctuary. Any other law enforcement agency can, for instance, let's say it's MS-13. He's a senior in high school, and he's a public safety threat. When we've been looking for him, now we know he's actually attending class today at a certain time. We're going to work with local authorities to go arrest that public safety threat. It's not about raiding schools, it's about raiding hospitals. It's about, in a rare circumstance, we got to find a public safety threat, a national security threat, and they're in one of these facilities. We're going to arrest them. Again, there's no sanctuary for public safety threats or national security threats. So it's not about raids. It's not about, so people should send their kids to school. We're not raiding schools. It's just a ridiculous concept that the left's pushing that false narrative.
Some of these students, of course, not gang members, those who've been detained. Let me ask you this. You, of course, worked for the Obama administration, an administration that was very successful in securing the border, deporting a lot of people, even that Democrats were critical of the administration for doing so. But a lot of the tactics being used now by the Trump administration were not used then, when those numbers were higher than they are now. So why have things changed under President Trump? Is there indeed some sort of quota system put forth by Stephen Miller or others?
Look, I did run enforcement and removal operations for Obama, and we removed and arrested a lot of people. We used a lot of the same tactics. Right now, because of the last 4 years of Joe Biden, we got over 10 million illegal aliens coming to this country illegally, and we got over 2 million known gotaways, 2 million people that crossed that border, weren't vetted, weren't fingerprinted. We don't know who the hell they are. But how many of them came from countries sponsoring terror? We had over 400 people on terror response tests for us on the southern border in 4 years under Joe Biden. And in the Trump administration, first Trump administration, we had 14. So the situation is totally different. So we got a lot of dangerous people released in this country. And we've seen a case example by case example of illegal aliens released in this country with a second-term bureaucracy and their property vetted, and they weren't. Because when we found them, many of them had serious criminal histories in their homeland. So Secretary Mayorkas said these people were probably vetted. No, they weren't. We never had access to many countries' criminal databases. Many of the countries where these aliens come from don't have any criminal database at all. They don't have the systems we had. So it's a different ballgame right now. The last 4 years of Biden administration, open borders, we know that public safety threats by the tens of thousands have been entering this country. National security threats made in this country. And again, 2 million people paid more to get away. They didn't pay less to an alien smuggler organization to get a free airline ticket to the city of their choice, a free hotel room, 3 meals a day, free medical care, and work authorization. 2 million people paid more not to get vetted, not to get fingerprinted. So it's a different ballgame. So we're taking this seriously, and ICE is not making this up. Everything we're doing, we're using laws established by Congress, enacted by Congress, and signed by the president. Even the Alien Enemies Act that a lot of people attacking, Congress passed that act. That's an act that's codified, and we're using every tool available to identify and remove as many public safety threats and national security threats as we can.
Certainly, you know, some of the critics of these moves say that these policies, those laws, Alien Enemies Act and the like, were not meant for this. One of his toughest critics right now is, of course, California Governor Newsom. We want to give you a chance to respond. Governor Newsom, in an interview with NBC News, said, quote, just get it over with in terms of you arresting him. He says, quote, he's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do it? He knows where to find me. So, Tom, arrest me. Let's go. That was the governor of California talking to you.
Well, look, I'm not biting on that. The NBC reporter that interviewed me very dishonest. We did a 20-minute interview, and he cuts out a little clip that makes me and takes my words out of context. Here's what we said. And he talked about what I talked about, these people that are these protests and rioting. When they cross the line, they got that. Well, here's what I said: they have a right to protest. They have the First Amendment rights, but they can't cross that line. They can't cross that line of impediment. They can't cross that line of putting their hands on officers. They can't cross the line of knowing, concealing, and illegal alien, because they're all federal crimes. They're in statute, and they will be prosecuted. When he asked the questions, that include Mayor Bass and Governor Newsom, I was clear: they haven't crossed the line, but they're not above the law either. If they commit a crime, they certainly will ask for prosecution. That's what was happening. I never threatened to arrest Governor Newsom, so I'm not biting off on that. It's just that reporter's dishonest, and let him play the whole 20-minute interview, and you'll see a whole different discussion that we had.
All right, NBC News, of course, stands by the reporting. Border Czar Tom Homan. Mr. Homan, we appreciate you joining us this morning. We'll talk to you again.
You got it. Thank you.
I want to go back to 1992 in Los Angeles when the Rodney King riots broke out. That was the last time the National Guard was in L.A. Then President George H.W. Bush deployed them at the request of the governor. The key word, highlighted, underlined, scored, exclamation point, is request. Now here we are, 33 years later, they are back, but not because the governor asked for it. Quite the opposite. Historian John Meacham joins us now. John, I'm so grateful that you're here, because the last time a president bypassed a governor was back in 1965 to protect civil rights protesters, to protect the protesters. It was 2 weeks after the Bloody Sunday March was met with violence on that Edmund Pettus Bridge. What are we to think about the fact that we have not seen this in 60 years? And here we are.
You know, James Madison in one of the key Federalist Papers talked about how one of the reasons we needed a constitution, one of the reasons the rule of law matters so much, is that, quote, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And that's one of the reasons we have norms, not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And I think the critical thing we're seeing here is a situation in which an American president is deliberately fanning flames about trying to make a critical situation, make an important situation into an existential one. And I think that serves his political purposes, but it does not fit within, I would argue, the American tradition of how presidents deal with a National Guard, which we've been dealing with, by the way, since 1794, which is when George Washington used militias to try to put down a rebellion. Not pretending this is easy, right? These are complicated questions. And it's why I want to go back to this. It's why norms matter. You know, a lot of people in the age of Trump think that people like me think of norms as these sort of quaint customs, that it's sort of how you play cricket or something. But they're more important than that. No particular statute can deal with every situation. And so you rely on the character of those with power. And in this hour, the character of the man in power is someone who wants to make a show of force no matter what the circumstances are on the ground.
But norms, to your point, aren't just these like quaint traditions. It was a different George. George Bush respected Louisiana's wishes after Hurricane Katrina. He did not federalize the National Guard. But here we have Trump ignoring California officials this weekend. They pleaded with him, please don't do this. Isn't that why this particular moment and the president's actions are so alarming?
I'm going to go back to this. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And I think without fear of your disagreeing with me, I think that's where we are. I think that norms matter because these are difficult calls. You and I couldn't sit here and come up with every situation where we would say for absolute certainty why a president should do X versus a government in situation Y. There are an enormous number of complicating factors. Those factors are not present here, right? The governor is, from all I can tell, doing everything that's appropriate. As you say, he asked for this not to happen. And I think we go back to something that was quoted in the New York Times way back, I want to say it was 2017, in which someone within the Trump White House said that he wanted to schedule every day of the presidency as if it were a reality show, as if he were vanquishing foe after foe. And I fear, to some extent, we've moved from Elon Musk, which was now seems like 17,000 years ago, but which just the other day, to this. And so I don't want to make some grand statement about that a president should never, obviously, should always follow a governor's wishes. That obviously was not the case in 1965. It was important for President Johnson to do what he did. This just doesn't feel that way.